There's a little confusion about sectioning, and it's been very hard for us. This is the first year the class is offered at Yale. It's been very hard for us to predict demand for the class, and so I think we may have overcorrected in terms of the number of sections we offered, and so now we have to scale back a little. So a couple of the sections which had like only 4 or 5 students interested in, we're going to have to cancel, but there's more than enough section time otherwise, and if for any reason this creates a special problem for you, you should let Sam know, and we will do our best to accommodate you. I don't want anyone not to be able to take the class because of any sectioning problems. First thing. Second thing, we'll continue to video cast the class, so we'll have videotapes at least for a while still, and we have archives of previous year's videos, so if you miss a class or have missed a class, it's not so hard to catch up. Also, I'll mention that the slide PDF, we're going to, as Sam mentioned the last time, we'll provide slides like every 3 or 4 or at most 5 lectures in arrears in little bundles of PDFs. They'll be put on the website and you can take them. We can't easily provide them in advance because for a variety of reasons. Now, are there any questions on the material so far? Yeah. Oh goodness, is it 05 and 12? I don't want to say because I'll screw it up. It's one of the morning sections, I think. There were like 4 kids that were interested, something like that. But you can email Sam, there should be made. Oh, one other glitch on the sectioning. Some students thought that poll we did after the first day, where we were trying to gauge interest at what times of day you guys wanted sections, that counted as if you had expressed an interest in a section. But actually, it only counts if you've used the formal Yale like CV2 procedures or something. Okay, so if you haven't formally sectioned, you should section so we know where you want to go. Any other questions? In the back there? Yeah? No? Okay. So last time we discussed how life expectancy at birth has increased and how this is kind of a broader phenomenon known as the health transition. And part of this health transition has also involved a shift in the cause of death and in the nature of illnesses. A shift from acute infectious disease and nutritional deprivation to chronic disease and mental disorders. And in addition, there's been a compression of morbidity so that we are living longer, we're dying of different things, and we're healthier while we're alive. And we also review different ways of defining health, the statistical, adaptive, and social sort of ways of defining it, and some ways of measuring health. And finally, we considered or introduced the problem of medicalization, and we noted the irony that even as while the population is living longer, there's an increasing sort of rise in these list of things that is considered to be a legitimate concern of doctors. And last time, for example, we looked at these data. So we looked at the leading killers, the rate per 100,000 100 years ago and nowadays. And right up here, most of the killers back then, the top 3 killers were all infectious, pneumonia, tuberculosis, diarrhea, and so forth. Also acute kidney infection and others, diphtheria made the list. And now that's changed completely. Pneumonia and influenza still are on the list. It was number 1, it's fallen to number 5. But now heart disease and cancer are the leading killers, and there's otherwise been a little of movement. And cancer has risen from number 8 to number 2 on the list. So one of the things we're going to begin to discuss today or introduce today is to begin to understand why did this happen? What are the causes of this change? And does it have, for example, something to do with medical care? Is this shift in the causes of death attributable to the changes in medical care that has been offered for the last 100 years? And are these diseases declining for a reason? And if so, what are those reasons that explains this change? Now, certainly there have been incredibly impressive advances in medical care in the last century. So beginning 100 years ago, we had the discovery of aspirin, blood transfusions, EKG machines, more than 100 years old now, insulin in the 1920s. In the 1930s, we have the discovery of antibiotics, first the sulfonamides and then the penicillin antibiotics. 1952, we get polio vaccination, structure of DNA, oral contraceptives in the 50s, organ transplantation in the 60s, CT scanners invented in the 70s, and anti-HIV medication in the 90s. And all of these have had substantial life-saving effects on individual recipients and have improved the health of the population. And it's reasonable to ask, for example, whether the discovery of antibiotics at the time of World War II had something to do with what I illustrated on the previous slide. We used to have top killers used to be infectious, now they're not. Maybe it's because we invented antibiotics in the intervening period of time. And in fact, you can also get a sense of changes in healthcare over the last 100 years just by looking at some pictures. This is a typical hospital 100 years ago. 1893, this is what a hospital looked like. And if you go forward by about 50 years, this is what it looks like. The nurse gets a little hat, and it can offer a little soup to the patient who's sitting in the bed, and you can go forward more, and, well, you get equipment now. There's like something that can hold up a broken extremity or something like that. And not much change, and this is what it looks like today. And in fact, this type of a situation, the patient is so surrounded by technology, so invaded, in fact, by technology, has even resulted in, these dramatic changes have even resulted for some patients in a kind of guide being required. And here's a brochure put out by the Society for Medicine with a little picture of a patient, and at the top the brochure is called, "What Will My Loved One Look Like When They're in the Hospital?" And there's a list of all these things that could be, attached to your loved one. Heart monitor leads, pulse oximeters, a Foley catheter in the urethra to remove urine, peripheral IVs, a blood pressure cuff, arterial lines, which is kind of a gross thing, is when you put the IV into an artery instead of a vein. Always used to freak me out as a physician. Central line, or a PA catheter, where you put like a huge catheter, a tube, in the person's to the heart. A ventriculostomy, a tracheostomy tube, a chest tube, a nasogastric tube, a dialysis catheter, an intra-aortic balloon pump, where you put like blood. And this technology has advanced to the point where people or their loved ones actually need a manual if they're in the hospital. And in fact, this brochure is intended to inform people of the existence of all these various lines. But there's even the suggestion in the title of this pamphlet that patients might be rendered unrecognizable by the technology that's being deployed upon them. And in fact, if we want to get a handle on how healthcare technology has changed in the last 100 years, we can talk to physicians. Here's what a former teacher of mine said when I was at the University of Pennsylvania 20 years ago, or approximately. He said, "When I was a young doctor in the 1940s, we were led to believe that certain diseases had certain courses. For instance, there was nothing we could do for individuals who had subacute bacterial endocarditis. We were taught that you couldn't cure that and that the course of the disease was 2 or 3 months. You could be much more definitive in those days. We didn't have anything we could do for patients. For instance, Addison's disease due to tuberculosis was another one for which there wasn't anything you could do. They all died. And roughly, we would divide leukemics up into acute leukemics and those with chronic lymphocytic leukemia, and we knew that the latter would live for a much longer period of time. We could give them a little radiation or something, whereas the acute leukemics would die. Most kids with leukemia in my early days all died. We just began to get antibiotics when I was in school. Penicillin just came in about that time, what little became available. And before that, people who got pneumococcal meningitis, most of them died. We didn't have much to do about it. We knew if they had meningitis, well, these. Hard to actually link back to a history, to a point in time when medical care was to be awed and amazed by the changes that have taken place of individuals who are still living. So it would seem, given the very real changes in medicine, changes which people who are alive actually experience and can give testament to, it would seem that medicine was a big part of the improvements in life expectancy in the last 100 years, and that we've begun to introduce so far in the class. So this is an illustrative cartoon. Some of you may possibly have seen it before. Imagine the number of people dying of a particular condition, say measles, per 100,000 population across time, say since 1900. So on the x-axis is time, say since 1900, and on the y-axis is the population death rate, fraction of people dying of these conditions. So I want you to think about it for a moment, looking at this slide, and answer the following question. When do you think that a specific medical treatment for the disease in question, say measles, might have been introduced? When was the treatment for this disease invented? Was it at time point A, B, C, D, or E? Raise your hands if you think it was A. Be honest, just raise your hands. A. Okay, B. C. D. E. Okay. Well, here's the data based on measles. This is the mortality rate per 100,000 on the y-axis and the time on the x-axis. The specific treatment for measles was introduced in the time period on the far right there in the 1960s when measles vaccinations was the specific treatment that medical care could offer to, I love this, could offer to take care of different sorts of conditions. Now this kind of analysis that I've just shown you was introduced by a British medical historian, Thomas McCune, and was very influential in stimulating people's thinking about this topic. Now, let's say, incidentally, that measles primarily affects the young. It does. Do you think that this decline here might be due simply to increasing aging of our society, meaning that there's a decrease in available victims? So, for example, maybe what's going on is not anything to do with measles vaccination or anything else, but the rate of measles can be attributed to a shift in the age structure of the population. Is that possible? Yeah, that could be happening. People could be getting old. You know, now we used to have 100,000 people and half were young and half were old. We have 100,000 people and only 10% are young, and so there are fewer cases of people dying of measles every year. Well, it turns out that actually this phenomenon would still be observed even if we adjusted for the changing age pattern in the United States over this time period. And this notion of adjusting for other factors is something we'll return to. And again, we see the same pattern. So for example, if you look at measles, that's on the upper left, I just showed you. Scarlet fever, penicillin was introduced. Tuberculosis, isoniazid was introduced. Typhoid, chloramphenicol was introduced. Again and again and again, what we see is the introduction of the specific medical advance well after the condition was already disappearing from the population. Thus, the general and by now obvious point here is that it is not specific medical interventions, discoveries, or treatments that are primarily responsible for the decline in mortality from all these infectious diseases in the last century. That's not what happens. Infectious diseases or genetic lengthening of life or decline in or change in pattern in causes of death. Insofar as we're talking about infectious disease. Now, if it's not medical care, let's consider a non-infectious illness. So scurvy is a non-infectious illness. It results from a deficiency in vitamin C. Vitamin C is relevant to collagen synthesis. And the typical pathologic manifestations of vitamin C deficiency are noted in collagen-containing tissues such as skin, cartilage, teeth, bone, and capillaries. And when you have scurvy, you get the loss of your teeth and multiple organs and mucous membranes and your skin. And a person with this ailment looks pale, feels depressed, and is partially immobilized. And scurvy was at one time very common among sailors who at sea longer than perishable fruits and vegetables could be stored. And here's the case of measles plotted alongside cases of scurvy. So here now the same plot as before. Here's the measles mortality per 100,000 over the last 100 years, shown in purple. You've already seen that data. And here's scurvy mortality per 100,000, shown in blue. And as you can see, both of them decline in synchrony. From this relationship between scurvy and measles, one could surmise that it's some other sort of general improvements in human well-being that must be at work, because measles treatments are not effective against scurvy, and scurvy treatments are not effective against measles. And in fact, there's an increase in public health awareness and poverty that was most likely responsible for the decline in infectious diseases seen across this time. Incidentally, what do you think might be the cause of the bump in scurvy right over here? See this bump here? Any ideas as to what might have caused that? Raise your hands. Oh, you can speak up too, but so I can see you. Yeah, World War II. So what's happening in World War II? Kids are nutritionally deprived. You bump into a case of scurvy. It goes away again. Now this pattern we've been discussing is in fact not uniform. And certainly some conditions yielded not socioeconomic change, so let's be honest, to specific medical interventions. And here's more detailed decline of pneumonia bacterial disease that is often hard to distinguish from influenza and influenza combined. Influenza is a viral illness. Pneumonia or pneumococcal pneumonia is a bacterial illness. In the olden days, and still nowadays sometimes, it's hard to distinguish the two. So this is just sort of pneumonia that we're plotting here. And you can see that a decline was already afoot, but that actually after the discovery of antibiotics, it really picked up the decline. Okay? So pneumonia cases were declining for the first part of the century, but then you have the discovery of antibiotics, and then they really disappear. Who knows what this spike is here? Raise your hands. Yeah? Spanish flu, exactly. Spanish flu was a worldwide pandemic. It killed over 20 million people around the planet in that period of time. So that's that. So the invention of antibiotics accelerated, but it was declining beforehand. And in some way, I think you could argue that this success, this discovery of penicillin, has cursed medicine ever since. Because penicillin turned a disease that was generally fatal into one that rarely was. It was actually truly a miracle. But there has never been another penicillin. In some sense, there's never been another medical discovery that has had such a not only in a population level sense. In some sense, penicillin has caused problems because it's raised expectations about the power of medicine to levels that are actually impossible to repeat. And nevertheless, penicillin truly was a medical discovery that had a discernible impact on population health. Now, we can get other sorts of data on the utility of medical care with respect to public health. For example, we could imagine an experiment in which we simply eliminated doctors from our society. So if we're trying to estimate what is the impact of medical care on longevity and health in our society, it'd be great if we could randomly assign this group of people to never have any doctors and this group of people to have doctors. We can't actually do that, but natural experiments. And these natural experiments might, for example, take the form of very rare strikes by doctors. And your readings for today provide examples of data regarding 5 strikes by doctors from around the world between 1976 and 2003. And these strikes lasted between 9 days and 17 weeks. And the analysis of the data showed that mortality in those strikes stayed the same or decreased in some cases during and even after the strike. So doctors going on strike had no measurable effect on mortality in that population. Sometimes people even got healthier when there weren't doctors available to take care of them. And none of the studies, none of the investigations of doctor strikes has ever found an increase in mortality during the strike. So there are a number of possible explanations for this, and one possibility for decrease in mortality during strikes includes a delay in getting surgeries, so people who don't actually need anything urgently they don't get that surgery during a strike, and so you lose those mortalities, those cases of people that die because of elective surgery. Or perhaps a decline in doctor-caused injuries. We'll see later in the course, iatrogenesis, or the injuries that doctors and the healthcare system cause to patients themselves, is actually one of the leading killers in our society. So the health of the population improved, at least in the data we saw in the paper for today. Thus, the sources of gains in expectancy during the 20th century can be divided into 2 categories. On the top, we have medical care, or big medicine. This includes doctors and tests and treatment, and all of the things that you guys are accustomed to thinking of when you think of medical care and when you think about why we're healthy as a population. Probably think of medical care. And another source of gains in life expectancy includes socioeconomic change and public health interventions. Here the argument is that it's not so much what doctors are doing, but other things that are happening in our society that are responsible for this radical improvement in well-being. And this could include nutritional improvements, sanitation and prevention, behavioral change, and rising wealth of the population. Now, mostly I would say the sources of gains in life expectancy in the United States during the 20th century has actually been the latter. And Preston, in the reading for today, downplays the role of nutritional improvements, at least in the United States in the 20th century, and he may be right. So even within the latter category, Preston says, I don't think it's nutrition that's the cause. He thinks it's the other things, the bottom 3 things on the list that might be the cause. Now, to be clear, I am not denigrating the role of science or the importance of medicine, because for a couple of reasons. First of all, because actually it was the germ theory of disease which led to great strides in prevention of infectious diseases with the adoption of hygienic practices and the like. So there were advances in knowledge that resulted in things being done differently that may have contributed to the bottom part of the list, first point. And second, I'm a doctor myself, right? It's very hard for me to imagine that, what I do to patients is actually harming them. Clearly, both sources are important, both big medicine and socioeconomic change. But big medicine is not the sole or even the main cause of increasing life expectancy in our society. Now, it turns out that these benefits in life expectancy, or increases or improvements in life expectancy, were differentially distributed by socioeconomic status. And this has resulted in widening SES differentials in mortality. And this itself also helps provide insight into the source of mortality decline. We're going to begin to understand what this longevity improvement and improvement in well-being and health in our society over the last century is not only to compare these big medicine to socioeconomic themes, but also to look at which segments of the population are benefiting. Because what is going on? To what extent is big medicine socioeconomic change? We have a number of illustrations of this point. The first one comes from your reading for today. You see the mortality rates in children according to the father's occupation in 1895, 1905, and 1923. Argues that the new hygienic practices associated with germ theory of disease were more likely to be adopted by the professional classes. And if so, and if those practices were effective, one should see a widening of social class differentials over this period and a change in class illustrate this point. So look first, for example, at the data in 1895. So here's the father's occupation. So this is relative child mortality rates by father's occupation in this time period. Here's the father's occupation. If you look in 1895, professionals, physicians, dentists, veterinarians, and teachers, the mortality rate of their children was about the same as for all children, okay? Normalized to 100. But the groups that did well were the farmers, who owned farms and were rich, and the managers in manufacturing firms, but not the foremen or the laborers in the firms, and not the farm laborers, okay? Their kids died at higher rates. The best off were the farmers and the managers. In the middle were the professionals, and then the laborers down below. And if you look forward to 23 years, you see a complete reversal of this pattern. Now, it's the professionals, just 30 years later, their kids are dying at the very lowest rates compared to the average kid dying. Of course, the laborers are still dying at higher rates, so are the farm laborers. And the advantage of managers and farmers persists to some extent, but the big bang is seen right there. So incidentally, this additionally indicates fairly clearly that physicians in 1895 had very few weapons at their disposal to advance survival. Because if doctors could actually do anything for anybody, surely they would have done it for their own children, and they would have fared better than anyone else's children. Evidence of that if you go back 100 years. So an additional thing, if you look at it from a macro perspective, there was nothing medicine could actually do to improve children in the late 19th century. But by 1923, the children of people with knowledge did better, and the children of professionals had the lowest mortality. So it's not medicine, it's access to knowledge that helps. And incidentally, this pattern may be repeating itself today with respect to the adoption of dietary and other practices that reduce mortality from chronic illness as opposed to acute infectious diseases. Upper socioeconomic status people are quicker to adopt behavioral practices that reduce mortality from chronic disease, as we'll see later in the course. Something similar is happening today. As knowledge enters, are the first to adopt it. And this leads to widening differentials, and it suggests that it's the use of such knowledge more than the use of medical care that may be explaining what's happening now with mortality patterns in our society. Now let's look at how the education differentials in mortality overall are also widening more generally. This figure is taken from the reading. In particular, focus on the middle panel. So this shows trends in educational differential in mortality. On the y-axis is deaths per thousand population in a log plot. and here's time, and look at the people that are this age. These are the 65 to 74-year-olds. And here's the pattern in 1960. Men and women, men are solid and women are dotted. And then these are different age groups over here. But if you look forward in 1971, basically you get a widening in both men and women. So this is the difference between the non-educated and the non-educated and the non-educated and the educated in 1960s is small. By 15 years later, it's widened, both in men and in women. And this occurred during a point in our history when Medicare was introduced in our society. And Medicare is our public insurance program for the elderly. Basically, if you're older than 65 in our country, you get free socialized medicine. You get free health care. Even though everyone older than 65 had access to, in principle, any medical care that they wanted, even so, you get widening differentials by socioeconomic status, as by education, shown in this slide. And this again suggests that it is still not big medicine that is driving improvements in health. It suggests that widening class differences and also the broader improvement in health and life expectancy are still being driven more by increasing socioeconomic status and other non-medical practices in the late 20th century as in the early 20th century. Again, it's access to knowledge about prevention that appears to be key. Incidentally, a similar pattern of continuing widening differentials despite broadening of access to health care was seen in the United Kingdom, comparing the time before and after the introduction of the National Health Service in 1948. Similar sort of national scale natural experiment that was done in England in the 1940s. A similar kind of thing happened even in that country. Now I'd like to come forward to the second half of the 20th century and examine current leading killers in cancer and cardiovascular disease. So first of all, when we study whether there have been improvements in our experience of cancer, what do we mean? When we say we're winning the war on cancer, which we're not, but what would we mean when we said that? We could measure a bunch of different things. We could measure how we're doing with respect to mortality of cancer, how many people are dying of cancer, how we're doing in terms of incidence, how many people are getting cancer, how we're doing in terms of survival, given the fact that you get cancer, or we could look at something like quality of life, which we introduced the last time. And quality of life might include measures that include limb or voice or breast-sparing procedures. So maybe we're not lengthening survival of people with different cancers, but we're giving them a much better quality of life. And it can include things like palliation and side effect reduction. Now, what to measure is what is contended in the Baylor and Klausner readings for today. Klausner was the head of the National Cancer Institute when he wrote that paper. So what they're arguing about is, are we making progress in the war on cancer? What aspects are we making progress on? And how should resources be allocated? Given what's happening, how should we spend our billions of dollars when it comes to cancer research or cancer treatment? And in many ways, figuring out what to measure and how to measure it is half the intellectual and actually political battle. Now, the three measures that they talk about in the article are related. So here is a person that's well, and then you can measure their point of time of death. At some point in time, you get the incidence, and close to it, presumably, the detection of a disease. And then you have death thereafter. This is the survival, conditional on incidence. This time spell is the incidence, and the overall is the mortality. Now, change the timing of incidence, for example, postponing or detection, for example, accelerating when we detect whether people have cancer. Maybe we invent a new test that detects whether you have cancer much quicker than it would have been in some previous time period. We don't necessarily change overall mortality. Right? So likely we invent a CT scan. In the olden days, we have to wait till here for your cancer to appear. Now we can detect it here. But in neither case do we do anything about whether you live or die. Changing the time of incidence or detection might change the survival, have no impact on cancer mortality. And if we were only focusing on survival, we might be fooled into thinking we're making great progress against cancer when all we're doing is improving our ability to detect it. Now, Baylor wrote this article that you read for today because he had written a prior one in 1986 for which he was heavily criticized. And in 1986, he writes an article that's saying, this is crap, we're making no progress, it's ridiculous. Critics said that important discoveries were just around the corner. We're about to cancer. Stand by, Dr. Baylor, they said. Just wait and see. And they also quibbled with the way he was measuring success. Well, Baylor waited and published updated statistics, and still things looked exactly as they did before. He waits another 20 years, he does the same analysis, and there's no improvement. And what do his critics say to him then? Did you read in class? What did the critics say? What? Yeah, stand by, give us another 20 years, it's just around the corner. Now, poor Dr. Baylor is a very elderly man. He's not going to survive, I don't think, another 20 years. And I hope that I will one day pick up this novel yet again in this time. So it's this endless recursion. It's like, just wait, just we're going to get another penicillin. There hasn't been much progress, depending on how you do it. Now, what was Baylor arguing? How are we doing when it comes to cancer? This slide shows mortality from all malignant cancers from 1970 through 1994 in the total U.S. population according to race and sex. And the rates have been age-adjusted to the U.S. resident population of 1990 to take into account the changing age structure of our society. So we need to take into account that people have, the composition of the society has different groups at different times. So we want to compare apples to apples. We have to normalize for that in some way. And you can see that the total mortality for cancer has not changed. Here's the total mortality, or maybe even slightly increased. And you can see again this pattern of widening differentials across time here with respect to race. So for example, if you look at black males and white males in 1930, they're different, but they're not as different as they are today. So once again, widening differentials across time. Here yet again with another socioeconomic variable, this race. Now, as I've already alluded to age adjustment, what is age adjustment, and what's the point of age adjustment, and why is it being contested in the readings by the authors? Well, if you looked at the number of deaths per capita in Sweden and in Panama and saw figures like this. Okay, so here is Sweden and here's Panama. Here are the number of deaths in a year. Here's the population, and the crude mortality rate for Sweden is about 1 in 100, and the crude mortality rate for Panama is even better. So 981 per 100,000 are dying in Sweden, 724 per 100,000 dying. Would we conclude that the Panamanians are healthier than the Swedes? Yes or no? No. Yes. Okay. Both are plausible. That's in fact what Baylor and Klausner are arguing about. Why yes? Who said yes? What would be a reason we would conclude they're healthier? Lower mortality. Fewer people are dying per capita, right? Why no? Who said no? Don't be shy. Yeah. Yeah, they could be dying of other things than cancer. So like, yeah, you have something else to say? They could be dying of something else than cancer. So maybe you're saying, well, they're not dying of cancer, but they're still dying, so we're not making any progress. That's a possible explanation. Yeah? Swedes are much older than the Panamanians. It's really not fair to compare the two. I mean, the Swedes are dying just because they're old, right? A 9-year-old in Sweden, and they're dying. That's different than 5-year-olds in Panama dying. So you have to adjust the population for age. This is one of the things these guys are arguing about in the essays that you read for today. So we would want to correct for age. To really compare the mortality of populations, we would want to take into account their differing age structures. And after accounting for the age structure of the populations, we'd see that actually the Swedes do have a much lower death rate than the Panamanians. So when you do the age-adjusted death rate, you in fact see what you kind of intuitively would have expected, was that the Swedes actually are healthier than the Panamanians' adjusted mortality. Here also helps to account for the fact, and this was your point over there, also helps to account for the fact that if you make progress against some diseases, the age structure of the population can change. So we really don't want, like if we cure a condition that kills kids, they'll eventually have to die. We want credit for that cure of having improved the health of the population. We don't want to say, well, they just still died. There were 100 people and they all died eventually, no matter what we did. That's not giving us credit for the fact that, yes, but they all died when they were 100, not when they were 5, okay? So for example, a decline in infectious diseases leads to an older population, and we may wrongly conclude that cancer has become a bigger killer, whereas it's the same killer as it always was, it just now has more suitable victims, okay? So you need to adjust the age. But you might also adjust for other things, and this is also very debated. Where do you stop adjusting? Do you adjust for economic status? Do you adjust for race? Do you adjust for education? And which of those things is legitimate or not legitimate is not usually a scientific question, although sometimes it is. It's often a rhetorical question, like what is your intent in doing this type of a calculation? However, to be fair, updating these data since the Baylor-Klausner exchange does suggest that there is a trend in the early 1990s of declining death rates that actually has continued until today. So this was the paper, the data was published, but actually if you bring the data forward, you know, actually maybe death rates from cancer are now beginning to decline. Maybe when they wrote the paper it wasn't quite fair. You see here the decline over here, both in men and to a lesser extent in women. But even if that's true, it only brings us back to where we were in 1950, right? 60 years of the war on cancer, and we're now finally back at the starting gate. We're back where we were when we started this thing. Yeah. Yes. Right. So that's the whole one of the things that they're arguing about. So maybe now we've cured some things. So maybe the is not quite enough. Maybe we need some other way of studying the data to get full credit for the progress we're making in cancer. And this is one of the things that they are contesting in the paper. But I don't think, and so first point is that maybe we're back where we were. And second point, this still doesn't address if it is treatment that's most responsible for any decline in the population cancer rates. So even if it's the case that the cancer rates are declining, maybe it's still got nothing to do with big medicine that's resulting in this. Moreover, closer examination of which cancers have been declining, as Baylor shows, reveals that the diseases that have declined in the recent period appear to have done so either in response to changes in health habits, for example, tobacco and lung cancer, we're finally kicking the habit of smoking, and that's what's beginning to bring the cancer rate down. So it's got nothing to do with the treatment of lung cancer. It's that public health interventions regarding smoking have changed. Or, as Baylor shows, it's due to screening practices, colorectal, breast, and prostate cancer screening. So again, it's sort of preventive interventions, not therapeutic interventions, that are responsible for this decline. And this, after all, is the underlying political debate here. Cancer on a case-by-case basis, using individual medical care, for example, chemotherapy, or do we treat it on a collective basis using public health interventions, for example, screening or health education campaigns? And Baylor is saying, please, let's do more on the prevention and non-big medicine side. And Klausner is saying, no, please give more billions to us because we're working on the big medicine side. Baylor is saying, we're wasting our money on you. It's stupid. We're not actually getting our bang for our buck. And that's what they're fighting about in the exchange. Now, the argument that it is not medicine that is most responsible for any cancer mortality, but rather prevention and public health interventions strikes me, at least, as very compelling. And here are some ways to prevent cancer and to truly reduce mortality. Serious about reducing cancer, where should we be spending our money and what should we be thinking about? We should be thinking about how to decrease tobacco use, exposure to environmental carcinogens, how to lead to changes in diet or personal habits, and how to employ secondary prevention techniques like pap smears or colonoscopy. And note that chemotherapy is really not even on the list of big impacts we might have in terms of improving the health of our society when it comes to cancer. Now let's turn to look at what's been happening to cardiovascular disease. So we spent some time on infectious disease at the beginning of today. We talked about cancer. Now let's look a little bit at cardiovascular disease. It too has been declining since the 1960s. So this is the age-adjusted mortality for cardiovascular disease from 1900 to 1996. Here's again on the mortality rate on the y-axis, time on the x-axis. And here's total cardiovascular disease has been declining in the recent part of this century. Coronary disease, stroke, and so forth. Now what are some possible explanations for decline? Why? Why is heart disease also declining across this time? Well, there could be decline in tobacco use. We saw some evidence for that already. Changes in diet. Maybe people are eating less fat than they were 30 or 40 years ago. An increase in proportion of hypertensive people being treated effectively. Maybe actually the drugs that we're giving are working. We're giving people antihypertensive drugs, and that's resulting in the decline in cardiovascular mortality. Maybe there's just a decline in blood pressure. People's risk factors profile is changing. or some kind of decline in cholesterol levels, another risk factor, maybe it's changing. Big medicine, improvements in medical care since the 1970s. Beta blockers, aspirin use, heparin, thrombolytics, stents, surgery, ICUs. Maybe the invention of our EMT system, our ambulance system. Maybe that's what's causing the decline in the last 30 or 40 years. Or maybe it's a prior decline in infectious diseases. Theories about the inflammation in the coronary artery. Would you in your coronary artery that's the reason of the plaque? One of the biological theories about the origins of cardiovascular disease, like I just described, and its reduction, one of the reasons we're not dying of cardiovascular disease anymore is that we've previously dominated or fixed or begun to reduce the incidence of infectious diseases, okay? And so we're now getting a second-order benefit from those changes. Cutler estimates that the discovery and use of post-myocardial infarction treatments has contributed only about a third of the decline in cardiovascular disease mortality. So in the reading for today, Cutler says, look, the big medicine is probably only about a third of the decline. And the use of preventive medication, for example, antihypertension, cholesterol, or anti-diabetes, has helped, and he thinks account for about a third. And behavior change, he thinks, may explain about the remaining third. So in Cutler's estimation, in this example too, guys, actually it's not big medicine that's really having the impact that you might think. Now, curiosity about the explanation for the observed decline in coronary disease prompted the World Health Organization to do something known as the Monica Project in the 1980s. And this was a study of trends in cardiac disease and its risk factors, that recruited 38 populations in 21 countries, including the United States, China, Spain, and countries around the world. And one of the key questions in this study was, could any declines in blood pressure noted over this 10-year period be attributed to its treatment or to some other factors? So first of all, let's track blood pressure in all these countries around the world over 10 years and see what's happening to blood pressure. Maybe it's just going down on its own, first. And second, why is the blood pressure going down? Does it have something to do with treatments that we're inventing and giving to patients? And there are several insights in the data that suggest that the decline in blood pressure could not be attributed to a wider use of more effective medications. And I'll try to walk you through this because it's subtle and very important. So the question arises, was there a decline in blood pressure only in certain parts of the distribution, for example, in high readings only, or across the entire distribution with similar falls in the bottom, middle, and top of the distribution? And since people at the bottom of the distribution are not the ones being given the drugs, if declines are seen across the whole distribution, it would suggest that something other than the treatment of high-risk individuals is what explains the drop. So let's look at this. Let's say we plot the distribution of blood pressure at two different time points, shown in red and shown in blue. What we find is that in the olden days, you had this blue curve, and now you have this red curve, and the whole curve is smoothly shifted to the left, so everyone has slightly lower blood pressures now compared to before. That suggests it's socioeconomic change. Everyone is benefiting. Everyone's blood pressure is going down. If, on the other hand, you see something different, let's say the mean remains the same, but it's because we're treating people. We only treat people at this end of the distribution. We're not giving drugs to people at this end of the distribution. And what it means that these people up here in the blue line, they're getting big medicine, their blood pressure is being dropped, but they're not being removed from the sample. What happens if you take someone with a systolic blood pressure of 180 and give them medicine that reduces their blood pressure to 150? What happens to them? They're still there. They don't disappear from the population, but now they're in a different part of the distribution. So they lead to a little bump up in this part of the distribution. Does everyone understand this argument? Let me walk you through a little bit clearer. So the question is, are we moving versus deforming the distribution? So here's the original distribution. A secular change would result in everyone uniformly being shifted. The mean gets shifted, okay? But here, in this situation, you take some of these people, you reduce their blood pressure, so you remove them from here, but you tack them onto this part of the distribution. So you get this kind of deformation. And in fact, the empirical data from diverse sources look like this population, not big medicine. You see a smooth movement in the blood pressure distribution across these 10 years. Here's another study from Denmark that shows a still unexplained shift to the left that in these stereotypically bell-shaped distributions. And this decline occurred even before the widespread use of effective hypertensives. So for example, here we are in 1964, 1978, 1991, the curve keeps moving to the left, and some of this big movement in this curve to the left is occurring even before we invent antihypertensive medications. Okay? More evidence that it's not big medicine that's leading to in the mortality from cardiovascular disease in our society. Now indeed, not every secular trend in human biology must be due to the use of medication. For example, since, for example, menarche, the age at onset of first menstrual period, has also shown a similar change. And there's no sense in which this has arisen as a result of deliberate use of medication. So here's something else that's happening. This is the secular trend in age at menarche from 1850 to 1990. As usual, we have very good data from the Scandinavians. Back in 1860 in Norway, the average girl got her first period when she was almost 17. And now in Norway, the average girl gets her first period, or back in 1950, when she was, let's say, almost 14. Now it's like 12 or 10. I think the average age at menarche in our country right now is fourth or fifth grade. And that's, I mean, that's a lot of responsibility for a young girl, and it's actually a little bit world, but you know, it's kind of a lot for a 10-year-old girl to have to cope with that. But that wasn't the way it was 100 years ago. So something is happening to this very fundamental aspect of our physiology, namely the age of first period, that's got nothing to do with medication. It's not because we're treating girls with drugs that make them menstruate earlier. So things can change in the population, and these things may have nothing to do with big medicine. So the balance of prevention and therapy always needs to be assessed. And it's politically contentious, as we saw in the Baylor-Klausner exchange. And according to Cutler, the typical adult will require that $30,000 be spent on cardiovascular treatment over a lifetime, but gains $120,000 in net present value due to this increased longevity in calculations that are reviewed in the reading for today. So the return on investment from treatment of cardiovascular disease is about 4. The typical adult will require that about $1,000 be spent on cardiovascular behavioral change and prevention, but actually gains between $7,000 and $30,000 in net present value due to increased longevity. So the ROI for prevention is, you know, between 2 and 10 times as great as the ROI for treatment. This is what causes these debates to be so politically contentious. People have different ideas about how we should be spending different positions. That's valuable as a society to do. And we'll return to this again later in the class. And in fact, this issue of prevention versus treatment will be a recurrent theme. Now, all of these changes in disease incidence, whatever their cause, are not going to make us immortal. All of these changes, whether they're due to socioeconomic change, making us healthier and live longer, or due to big medicine, where we can treat people when they have a disease, are not going to magically transform us into creatures that never die. These observations about increasing life expectancy, however, do raise the question of what the upper limit of human longevity might be. What if current trends continue, then how long might we live? And here's some estimates of maximum life expectancy at birth based on various populations. So if we wanted to imagine, well, what could be the maximum time that humans live? Well, let's look at some long-lived populations. Here's the US in 1986, life expectancy at birth. Here's Japan in 1988, a very long-lived population. Here, Mormon high priests, an exceptionally long-lived population for a variety of reasons. And Manton estimates in this paper, it modeled what would happen to humans if they did everything right. They wore their seatbelts, they never drank, they had a loving marriage, they never smoked, they were well integrated into their community, they flossed, they slept well, they didn't do drugs. If they did everything we know that's good for your health, if you added it all in, what would be life expectancy? Manton estimates, yeah, there you go, flossing. Manton estimates the average life expectancy would be about 100 years. Now, another way to think about this is as follows. Imagine we could divide the causes of death of human beings into two categories, intrinsic and extrinsic. and intrinsic causes of death arise from the failure of biological processes that originate within an organism. So why do you die? It's got something to do with your body. Cellular apoptosis, telomere shortening, breakdown eventually in the fabric of your body. Something to do with you and your body. That's intrinsic. And extrinsic causes, which are causes of death primarily imposed on the organism by outside forces. Something that happens outside your body. A tree branch falls on you, or a car hits you, or you're killed by someone else. Imagine you can divide these two, or you inhale toxins. Imagine you could divide these two. Consider an experiment in which animals are maintained in an optimal environment where they are completely protected from infectious diseases, aggression, accidents, and so forth, and all deaths arising from external forces have been eliminated. Every animal in this population would theoretically achieve their lifespan potential and succumb ultimately to an intrinsic cause of death. So if we eliminated all extrinsic causes of death, would we live forever, or at least for a very long time? And could we also make progress against the intrinsic causes? For example, with gene therapy, nanotechnology, or cyborg technologies, which we'll also discuss at the end of the class. So the question now is, well, what if we could somehow stop all extrinsic causes of death and begin to make progress against intrinsic causes using some kind of futuristic technology? What would happen? And this too has resulted in a debate amongst various kinds of scientists. And when scientists have this kind of debate, sometimes they make a bet. And there's a long and famous tradition of scientific bets that are intended to distill to their essence and force people to think as clearly as possible. And a number of famous historical bets include one between Alfred Russel Wallace, the famous naturalist, who bet John Hampden in 1870 that the Earth was not flat. Hampden was still insisting in 1870 that the Earth was flat, and Russell said, put your money where your mouth is, let's make a bet on this. And in 1980, economist Simon famously bet population biologist Paul Ehrlich that the price of metals would decline over 10 years. Actually, this argument about this bet are still continuing. So one of them was a kind of doomsayer that's saying there's population explosion, we're overexploiting the Earth, and we're going to evaluate this by looking at the fact that the price of a basket of metals is going to skyrocket. Simon says, no, that's not going to happen. Ehrlich says, yes, so they bet. And in 2005, there was a bet that is relevant to what we've been discussing today, namely whether or not people could not live to be 150. Human beings to live to be 150 years or not. And it relates to intrinsic versus extrinsic mortality and the upper limits of human lifespan. If we progressively all extrinsic causes, accidents, diseases, and so forth, if we were able to cure all diseases, will we simply be immortal, or are we pre-programmed to die at some point? And on the two sides of this bet are my friend Jay Olshansky, who's a demographer, and he said that 130 is the top end of a human lifespan. And on the other end of the bet is Stephen Alstad, who's a zoologist. He believes that someone will live to be 150 years old by the year 2150. So how did they make this bet? Well, the heirs of the scientist who wins the bet will collect the prize. And the prize is $500 million, which is the estimated value of a trust fund that the two men inaugurated in 2005 with $150 each. And the trust calls for each scientist amount of money to the trust annually for the next 150 years. So this guy said, look, we're each going to put, Alsted and Olshansky said, we're not going to be alive for this bet. We're each going to start a trust fund at the Bank of America or Chase Manhattan or some bank we think will be there in 150 years. We're going to put $150 in today. Each of our heirs will put in a small amount of money for the next 150 years. And through the miracle of compound interest, in 150 years, there'll be a $500 million payout that's going to go to our heirs when the bet is adjudicated. And the outcome is this 150-year-old, one of the further stipulations, must have been alert throughout his or her entire life. And the outcome is to be judged on January 1st, 2050, by 3 scientists chosen by the president of the American Academy of Arts and for the Advancement of Science, relying on 3 standard forms of identification, such as birth, marriage, and death certificate. And Olshansky and Ostad also agreed to defer to the scientific expertise and methods of the future to determine the age. So what they were betting on was a baby born today, is there someone alive today who by 2150 will have lived to be 150 years or not? Are we unavoidably going to die before then because of intrinsic causes of mortality? Or will there be socioeconomic change and big medicine advances such that by that time period, someone will live to be more than 150, which has never happened before? Unfortunately, we're not going to be around to see the outcome of that bet. What? You could be the one. Will you be around in 2150? If you live that long, yes. You're less than 30 now, that's right. You could be the one. Exactly. Any of you could be the one. So what's interesting, though, is what's not a part of the bet. And what's not a part of the bet is whether everyone will have the opportunity to live to be 150, or whether, as seems so unavoidable, the rising tide will not lift all boats, but only some of us at the top of the socioeconomic scale will be lifted more than others. Maybe not everyone will have access to these improvements, whatever they might be, and whatever their extent. Thank you. See you next time. Any questions? Yes?
I was just wondering, it seems like there's a lot of gray area between intrinsic and extrinsic
Yes.
types of death. So how do you modulate between the two?
Yeah, you could fight about what counts as an extrinsic or intrinsic cause. So is dying of heart disease an intrinsic or extrinsic? Maybe you've been exposed to tobacco and then it would be extrinsic. Maybe you would get heart disease anyway, it's intrinsic. So that would need to be adjudicated. Other questions? I should say that I'll usually allow time at the end for questions, and I should handle this better. So I'd rather you not sort of get up and go. So I'll end the lecture, and I'll give a little time for questions, and then I'll let you go within a couple minutes, unless there's. And you shouldn't be shy about asking questions. There's been a change in your generation where you guys feel like I'll handle you if you guys are out of line, so you don't have to worry. Okay? Yes. Like if you ask a stupid question, I'll handle it very gently. You won't be embarrassed. I'll make you feel smart, and then we'll move on. And if there are too many questions, I'll also stop. So I can take care of it. Yes.
In terms of cancer prevention, how do you differentiate between factors that lead to cancer and causes, especially because like lung cancer or lymphoma or something, those things can be really individualized and you can't really have like a pinpointed origin. So how do people who try to prevent those diseases, how do they determine which causes are?
You mean if there's multi-causal effects? Yeah, so there are multiple things that contribute to it. That's exactly right. So what we do statistically is we partition it. We say, okay, we can't be 100% sure what caused your cancer, but in 100 people we can know that about 30% of the variation is attributable to smoking, and 30% to viruses, and 30% to something else. So we can estimate, and then we can, as we make progress against each of those, we see the population level decline. But in any given individual, it's often hard to know exactly what was the cause of their heart disease. Was it their diabetes, or their obesity, or their smoking? And in fact, those things intersect, and interestingly, they intersect in non-linear ways, which makes it hard. Yeah?
Especially for infectious diseases, though, when we were looking at the graph where the vaccine came in at the very end of the decline,
Yes.
doesn't that still have a very important role to play, though, because it doesn't actually eliminate the disease completely, which is very
Yes.
different from the
Yeah, so exactly. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have measles vaccination. In fact, later on, I'll have very harsh words for any of you who had wacky parents who didn't vaccinate you, because you're burdening the rest of us, and we can duke it out if you want. No, I'm not saying that big medicine is useless. You need to understand what I'm saying, and this is a tension that I struggle with, and we'll come back. I'm just saying that to the extent you thought big medicine was what's making you healthy, you're wrong. That's not actually what's making you healthy. It's contributing something, but it's a tiny part of the overall benefits. Yeah.
So the death rates that you're showing us, are they per 100,000 deaths or per 100,000 people?
It can be done either way. They were both ways in today's talk. Usually they were per capita, per population.
Okay, so more people are dying of cancer because they're not dying of other things.
Exactly.
So wouldn't it be more illustrative to only do per 100,000 deaths?
Well, I've shown you some data like that too, and you could do that way, but what you really try to capture is by age adjusting, you try to capture that. So we're making progress against, and that's the kind of squeezing the balloon thing, like you squeeze a balloon and it kind of balloons over here, and then you squeeze it over there and it balloons over there. Everyone has to die of something, and that's a bit what's contended in the Baylor-Klausner debate, in fact. What counts as a squeeze? Other questions? Yeah? Okay, see you on Thursday.